Any backend development or web development typically uses a database. In this video, we will learn how to use MySQL with Node.js. So to get started, you should have MySQL installed on your machine. So the easiest way to do it is to download XAMPP from the website apachefriends.org and follow the steps to install XAMPP. It's an easy download and installation, and it's one of the easiest ways to install and run MySQL. So I would recommend it to you. After you have installed MySQL, create a database called testdb, and within that database, create a table persons which has a field ID, which is an auto increment primary key, a name, and an age. So this is the table and this is the database we will be using as examples in this video. Once you have created the table, we will just insert some values into it. So here we have inserted 3 values into the table persons: Jack 25, Mary 27, and Bob 29. So with this, for our basic purpose, the database and the table is ready. So let us now take our attention back to Node.js and how do we use this database with Node. So the first step we will need to do is we will need to do an npm install MySQL. So what this does is it installs the Node.js module for MySQL. And once you have installed it, then we can start using MySQL from Node. So the first exercise let's do is, from the table persons, we created this table persons in the database testdb. Display the details of all the persons. So that is our objective. So let us see how do we do that and what are the steps required to do it. So here is my VS Code, and in our VS Code, let us start doing it. So the first step is I will need to use the module that we had installed. So is equal to require MySQL. So this is the module we had installed using npm. So now we are with require, we will use this module in our code. Next, we will need to create our connection data. So which is a JSON and which has host is localhost. So the host is the server, your SQL server. So here it's installed on this machine. So I installed it using XAMPP. So it is localhost. User is root. That's the default user. Password is blank. And what is the database? The database we had created was testdb. So this is our connection data. Once we have created our connection data, let us just go ahead and get the details of all the persons. So let me create a function, show persons. And what it will do is it will fetch from the database the details of all the persons and just log them on the console. So for the first thing, we will need to create a connection. Let connection is equal to MySQL dot create connection with the connection data. So we have created the connection. Once we have created the connection, let's write our query. Let SQL is equal to select star from, and the table name was persons. Once we have done that, let's run this query, connection dot query. So that is how we run it. What is our SQL? This is our SQL. And once the response comes, so function error comma result. And what do we do here? If error console dot log error, else what do we need to do? I will just do a console.log result. So we are just logging this on the console. If there was an error, we will log it on the screen. Otherwise, we will just log the result. So remember the query, the connection.query, this function query is an asynchronous function, and once the function is completed, it will either return an error or a result, and depending upon that, we will just log it onto the console. Let's save it and run this code. Localhost is not defined. I forgot to put it in quotes. Let's run it again. Now nothing ran here because I did not call this function. So let me just call this function in the code. So now it has given me the 3 rows we had inserted in the database. So Jack age 25, Mary age 27, and Bob aged 29. So these were the 3 values we had inserted, these 3 records we had inserted in that table. So we have gotten it. Let's see the example. Suppose there is an error. So let's say I do a select star from persons 1. Now there is no table called persons 1. So if I run it, what do I get? I get the log of an error. Error, no such table. Table testdb.persons1 does not exist. So this is where we got it. So I could have also just said console.log error in database error.message. So we could have done this also so that it's easier instead of getting the whole dump. And in this case, what do we get? Error in database, no such table. Table testdb.persons1 does not exist. Typically, logging the whole error helps us debug it at times. So you can use both of them as a standard practice. We just run it like this. So that's what we get. Another way we could do it is, suppose I gave a wrong database name. So the table is right, the database is wrong. Now what will happen? Now if I look at the, let me do a clear and run it again. So now what is the error we get? Unknown database testdb1. So we get an unknown database. So this is how we can get different errors, and depending upon if you want to debug it, you can debug and find it. So let's correct that. Let's correct this and run it again. And this is the output that we get. Next, what do we want to do? Display the details of the person whose name is specified. So we have displayed the details of all the persons. Now we want to display the details of the person whose name has been specified. So let's create a function show persons by name, and it takes a name as a parameter, and it will need to do, the steps would be very similar. Let's repeat them. Let connection is equal to MySQL dot create connection with the connection data. Once we have done that, let's create our SQL. Let SQL is equal to select star from persons where name is equal to, and how do we now specify the name? We just provide a parameter like this, question mark. Next, let us run our query, connection.query SQL. Now that SQL needs a parameter, in this case, the value of the name. So we can now, whatever we have specified as question mark, we can provide the parameter. So I can give the name, and then we have the function error comma result. The response from the query. So we can just do exactly the same thing. If error console.log error, so we log the error, else console.log result. Let's run this. So I can say, let me comment this function, show persons by name, and let's say we give it Jack. Let's run this code. So we just get Jack. If I gave, say, Bob here, let's run it again. So we get Bob. If I give somebody else who's not there in the database, then what should I get? I should get no rows. So this is how we have selected a person by name and provided the name as a parameter. And in our query, we provided the parameters we wanted to give it. Next, what do we want to do? In the table persons, insert the details of a new person. So we have been given the details of a new person and we want to insert them into the table. So let's define a function insert person. And what does it take as parameter? It takes, say, let's call it, say, params. Steps are similar, so let's create our connection is equal to MySQL dot create connection with the connection data. Let's define our SQL. Insert into persons name comma age. So these are the fields we are inserting into the table persons. And what are the values we want to insert? So values, so there are two parameters here, so we specify that. Now how do we write it? Connection dot query. Now this is the SQL, this is our params. So now here we would need an array of params, and in here the array should have two parameters because the first one should match with name and the second one with age. And we can have function error result exactly the same way. We run the query, we get its response, and we if error console.log error else console.log result. And then how can we call this function? So insert person, and we need to give it an array. The first is the name, so let's say put it Kathy and say 28. Let's run this. So here once we run it, we get the result. The result in this case is an OK packet, it's a JSON. And if we are wanting to get the ID, we can get the ID which was inserted, which is 4. So we could also say result dot insert ID. So I could say inserted ID of inserted record. So we could have said that. Now let's run it with, say, some other parameter, say Pam and say 29. Let's save it. So ID of the inserted record is 5. And now if we just go to show persons and run it, what do we get? We get these values have been inserted in the database and the ID, that auto increment field that we had put in, has been returned back. If I wanted to display the show persons just after the insertion, and we just said insert person, let's say we do George 33, and then we want to show insert persons, will this work or will this not work? Let's test it. So here we first get this print of the show persons, and then we get the ID of the inserted record. Why this is happening is because this is an asynchronous function, and before this returned, it went and executed the next one also. And in our subsequent videos, subsequent lessons, we will learn more details about asynchronous functions. But here it suffices to say that this will not give us the correct result. So if we wanted to display it, how should we display it? After, in the else, we can just put it that once it has been done, what can we do here? Here I can call my show persons, or I can create another query and run it. So we could have run another query here, and what would have that code been? I could have just put in the code that we have here. So let's call it SQL2. And now if we run it, what is happening here? Once we have gotten the response from the insertion, then we are selecting the details. So this would work now. So I'll comment it. And now if I insert, say, another person, say Albert 42. Let's see, what do we get? We first get the ID of the inserted record, which is 7, which is the response of the ID. And then we have fetched all the persons, and we get all the 7 people here. So this is how, if after an insertion we want to display the details or fetch the details, this is how we should do it. Let's look at the next thing that we want to do. Insert the details of the new persons. So in the previous one, we inserted the details of one person. Now, if we want to insert the details of multiple persons, how should we do it? So there could be two ways. One, I keep on calling this function insert person for each of the person, or we could insert in, we could give it multiple parameters, the details of multiple people at one go. So how can we do that? Let's see that. So let me define a function in insert persons. So instead of insert person, we have defined a function insert persons. It takes the params, and what does it do? The steps are very similar. We will create the connection, MySQL dot create connection data. Now what should be the SQL in such a case? So if I want to insert many persons, then what should we say? So let's define the SQL. Let SQL is equal to insert into persons, and what does it get? Name and age, values. And what we are saying is we just provided a single question mark, and let's see how do we run that. Next, connection dot query SQL comma params comma, and we have the standard function error comma result, and we just write a standard code. If error console dot log error, else console dot log result. Now how should we call this function? So let's define it, insert persons, and now we need to give it multiple details. So each person would have its own details, so it would be an array of arrays. So let's say we have Jim 30, Amy 34, Stephen 24. So we have these three persons, so which is why we put it in an array of an array. So it's an array of arrays. Now once we pass it here, if we are giving it in this fashion, we will just need to put it into an array here. So if I do it in this fashion, it will now run it for each value, each array in this. So it will insert 3 records. This is an error here. Yeah. So this is how it would run. So let's just run it. I will comment this insert person. So affected rows 3. So we got the affected rows 3 in this case because we inserted 3 persons. Let's now call the show persons. And you can see we can get Jim, Amy and Steven in it. So these were the 3 persons we were inserting and we were able to do it. If we wanted to display insert persons here, like we did in the previous one, we will need to, in the else, after the console.log, run the query and call it and show it. So this is the way we can insert multiple persons. Next, we want to update the details of a specific record. So the objective is to update the age of the specified person. So given a person's name, we want to update the age. Or let's say we are given the ID of the person and we want to increment the age. So let's define a function increment age and we have been given the ID of the person. How should we do it? Let me comment all this. The steps are the standard. So we create the connection. Let me create the connection. Let me copy it. Then we will need to write our SQL is equal to update persons set age is equal to age plus 1 where ID is equal to question mark. So given the ID, and let me make it capital here. So this is how we can write it. Now I can run this connection dot query SQL comma ID comma function comma result, and we can just write our standard code. So let me just copy that. So we have updated that. So now how do I call this function? Increment age, and whose age should we increment? Say Jack was 25, Bob was 29. So let's increment Bob. So increment age 3. Let's call that. So one row has been affected. Now if I fetch the details of the person, say Bob. Let's run it. So Bob's age has been incremented to 30. If instead of increment age, we wanted to do function change age, and we have the ID and the age, new age, let's call it. How would we have done that? Let's just copy this code and we will edit it. Update set age is equal to question mark, where ID is equal to question mark. So this will have two parameters, the age, okay, and we will in an array pass it what values? New age first, because that will match with the first parameter. The first parameter is age, and the ID. So this is how we would do it. And now if I, instead of increment age, say change age, say Bob to 33. Let's run that code. So affected, so nobody has been affected. Why? Because I had to provide an ID. Bob did not match. So what is the ID of Bob? 3, and the new age would have been this. Let's run that again. So one row has been affected. Let's get the details of Bob and see whether the age has become 33, and we can see that Bob's age has become 33. So if we had to provide multiple parameters, we put them into an array like we did for creating a new person, inserting a new person, the same way we have done here. Next, in the table persons, reset the data in the table persons by deleting all the rows of the table and then inserting the details of persons. So suppose now that we have been running this code for a while, we want to reset the data. So how can we reset the data? We want to delete from this and then reinsert the values in the table. So what we have here is the details as a JSON, an array of JSON. So we have the same 3 details that we have, but here it's an array of JSON. So we need to delete from the table first and then we need to insert it. So how should we do that? Function reset data. So first thing, let me create the connection. Now, what is my SQL1? Delete from persons. So once we delete from the table persons, then we will reinsert it. So first we are deleting all the values from persons, and let's run this query. Connection dot query SQL1. It does not need a parameter, and then the function request error comma result, and we just put in our standard piece of code. So this should delete from the table. Let's go ahead and do that. Let's see if our delete is working fine. So let me call reset data. So 13 rows have been affected. So most probably everything has been deleted. Let's just get show, let's call show persons and test it. So there are no data in the database, in this table. So once we have gotten it, console.log successfully deleted affected rows is, let's say, result dot affected rows. Once we have done this, then what do we want to do? Then we want to insert into this table. So I will first need to get the data. So let me say let persons is equal to. So I can require, if I require test data.js, it will give me a JSON and I can just deconstruct it. So I get persons as the array. Once I have gotten this array, I need, like we had created in this when we were inserting multiple persons, I need an array in which each element is an array with the name and the age. So I'll need to convert this JSONs into an array. So let's do that. So persons dot map p goes to each person. I will return an array p dot name comma p dot age. Let arr is equal to. So we have gotten our array. Once we have gotten our array, let us create our SQL. Let SQL2 is equal to insert into persons name comma age values question mark. This is exactly how we had inserted. If we go up and check insert persons, insert into persons name comma age values question mark. We will need to call this now. So connection dot query SQL2 comma. Now this array persons is an array of array, so we will need to put it into another array comma function error comma result and standard code. If error console.log error, else console.log successfully inserted, and let's just put the affected rows. So I'll copy it from here. So this is what we intend to do. So once we do it, we would get all the inserted rows in, and after that, if we wanted to display the table, then again within this console.log we would have called that show persons, written that code. We don't want to do that right now. This is enough for us. So let us now call reset data and run it. So successfully deleted affected rows 0 because we had already deleted them, and successfully inserted affected rows 3. So now if I call show persons and run it, so we get the 3. The only difference is that our IDs have changed in this case. So remember, because we are deleting it and it's running on an auto increment, the IDs have gotten deleted. The IDs have changed. So if you are using it in some other case just as a test exercise, you drop the table and then create the table back and insert it, the IDs should have remained the same. But that's not the objective right now, so we have not done that. So this is how we can do this part of the code.